Without further ado, we'll go ahead. I will call the meeting to order. It is May 3rd, 2022 at 7 p.m. And I'd like to welcome Selectman Shaker, Selectman Steve Dunn. We have our town clerk, Andrea DeStefan. We have our town treasurer, John Lucas, present tonight, as well as our town attorney, Dennis Copinos. If I could ask you all to please stand, raise the flag for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. It sounds like there's some more people in the lobby, but just move things along here. We're going to go ahead and elect our moderator for the evening. Are there any nominations from the floor for a moderator?
I nominate Will Meikle.
I'm sorry?
I nominate Will Meikle.
Thank you. Can I get a second for that? Thank you, Betsy. Is there any discussion on that? All in favor by show of hand? Say aye. Aye. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Will to the microphone, please. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here tonight.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start with ask for a motion to waive the reading of the call of the meeting. Can I get a motion from the floor? Bob Belden. Thank you, Bob. And a second?
Fred Ball.
Fred?
Fred Ball.
Ball. Great. All those in favor? Passes. Thank you. Is there a motion to waive the reading of the resolution? Thank you, Bob. Second? Betsy, thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, thank you. It's okay. At this point, I would like to invite Tara up to provide an overview of the budget, and then Dr. Burrell after that.
Just one correction. I will actually be briefing the one Board of Ed slide. So, I'd like to again welcome everybody and thank you all so much for being here. You may be wondering why I am wearing this t-shirt. And for those of you who were at the Board of Selectmen meeting last night, I recognized through Brookfield Cares, our coalition in town that does education and outreach on mental health issues and various other things, that May is actually Mental Health Awareness Month. So we as a board adopted a proclamation for the town of Brookfield where we proclaim May 2022 as Mental Health Awareness Month in the town of Brookfield. So we're calling upon all citizens, government agencies, public and private institutions, businesses, and schools to recommit our community to increasing awareness and understanding of mental health and the steps our citizens can take to protect their own mental health and those of their loved ones, and the need for appropriate and accessible service for all people with mental health conditions. This is something that's very near and dear to me, and I just wanted to reiterate that tonight. So I'm proud to wear this t-shirt to represent Brookfield Cares. So it's May already, and not only does that mean it's Mental Health Awareness Month, but it also means that it's budget referendum time. So I'm proud to present this budget tonight, and I'd ask that you please hold your comments till the end, which many of you are already well aware of. This is the agenda for the presentation I'll provide. We've already been through our call to order, our pledge, and we elected Will as our moderator. I'll first touch on our annual operating budget proposal. We'll talk about some dates, our goals, our concerns, an overall expenditure, and then break it down by category of town, school, capital, which is paid in cash. We've already gone over the bonded items, our debt service. We'll talk about our revenue, mill rate, reiterate the bonded capital, and then of course have our comments, which I'll ask you to hold to 3 minutes. And then of course our vote on the referendum date. Finally, John Lucas will provide the report as the town treasurer. So this is where we've been. I came into office in December, and I had already started hearing about the Board of Ed's budget. By January, I had my first review with all of our departments, and with each of the departments I did a very deep dive to better understand from their perspective what their requests were. By February, I received and adopted the Board of Ed's submission of their budget. In March, the Board of Selectmen, I have a little bit of a runny nose. The Board of Selectmen presented to the Board of Finance. On the 29th of March, we went to a special town meeting, as I mentioned, on the bonded capital, and the Board of Finance held their public hearing. Tonight's our annual town meeting. Hopefully, we'll be able to get toward our date of May 17th for our referendum. And if the budget passes by June 1st, the Board of Finance will have an approved mill rate, and then July 1st, we'll start our new fiscal year. So together, the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance, we truly did want to get to the best budget possible for Brookfield, and we had over 60 hours of budget meetings. It was quite intensive. We spent many late and long hours, so I appreciate everybody's time and commitment to this process. With the Board of Finance, just with the Board of Selectmen alone, we had 9 meetings, and some of those were with departments. So there's a lot of goals and a lot of goals and not many concerns, I should say, but the concerns are concerning. I'll just touch on each of these briefly, but our first goal is to provide efficient and effective quality services to all of our citizens in town. Of course, we want to provide an excellent education to Brookfield students of today and tomorrow. We want to properly maintain our capital assets at levels to maximize their value and longevity. We would like to continue to reduce our dependence on debt, our current debt balances. We want to continue refining and reviewing a long-term plan to provide for stability in our budgets. We need to live within our means, maintain our discipline, and closely scrutinize expenses in what I'm calling an era of fiscal frugality. As far as our concerns, inflation has had an impact on fixed costs and capital requirements. We've seen this in our own pocketbooks at home, not just across town. We have some debt obligations, and there will continue to be this 3 to 4 year spike in our annual debt service requirements. 2022 was actually the first year of the debt bubble. We're hoping to be using only one-time revenues for one-time expenditures and trying to avoid what I'm calling one-offs. Finally, we're keeping the increase in taxes as low as possible while still meeting our goals and continuing to manage our 10-year capital plan. So I just want to kind of emphasize that, this being my first budget, I personally looked at everything and I questioned everything. There were no free passes, and every line item I scrutinized, and I have to say that I needed a real compelling and significant justification as to what all of those line items were. So getting down to the nuts and bolts of it. First, talk about this summary of our expenditures. We have our town operations, our Board of Ed operations, our debt service, and then our capital. The majority of the increases, as you can see from this slide, are for both the town and the BOE operations, and these are driven by contractual obligations and salary increases. You can see the biggest increases, as I talk further in the slides, will be in areas of public safety primarily. And then, of course, the contracts as far as salaries and union commitments, so forth. So when I first started, I made some pretty drastic cuts, and I started to eliminate some discretionary items, travel and conferences. And this isn't a permanent solution, but I felt it was very necessary and needed during this period of the debt bubble and inflation. I want to remind everybody that the budget is online at brookfieldct.gov, and I'd encourage you to continue to look it over carefully, and please feel free to email me anytime or stop in at any point. And here's a graphic of how our money will be spent. Obviously, the orange piece of this pie is the biggest driver in the Board of Ed, with a 62% of the pie dedicated to the schools. Last year it was at 64%. Moving on to town operations. The bottom line on this slide is that inflation affects the town, as I mentioned earlier, just as it does on our own financial situations at home. Again, public safety, we see the most increase, and I'll touch on that briefly. There's been a demand on fire, EMS, and police. The fire marshal, we see some of the increases coming from some overtime. Our fire marshal went off onto active duty for COVID relief for the state of Connecticut, and as such, it produced extra time work on our deputy fire marshal. And that department also needed some new software, which came in at a higher cost. For the police, we had a slight increase in salaries. There was some disparity in the ranks. And we've also added car camera upgrades. They've also had some other new mandates across, down from the state of Connecticut for the new Police Act. For EMS, we're adding a shift. And I just wanted to touch on some of their response numbers. From January of 2021 to May of 2021, they had 497 responses. And in the same time period for this year, they had 737 responses. For fire, from January of 2021 till May of 2021, there were 229 responses. And for the same time period for this year, there were 320 responses. So that alone tells you that the demands on their work and time and efforts across town there's been an uptick. So we've addressed that by including a new shift for EMS. As far as culture and recreation, this covers a salaried employee in the library. And then we have a Parks and Rec increase where there's been a slight increase in small purchases for recurring costs such as mulch and beach sand and some mowing maintenance charges. Other than that, there's been really no significant new initiatives or any other operational changes. And again, here's a graphic on how our town operations will be allocated. The blue portion of the pie accounts for 47.1%. The orange slice of the pie, employee benefits, calls for 23% of the pie. And together, the blue and the orange accounts for 70.45% of the town budget on wages and benefits alone. And those benefits include life insurance, health insurance, Medicare, pension payments. On the town side, it's $822,000. On the BOE side, it's $400,000 in contributions for pension payment. Property services, the yellow piece covers utilities, tree removal, cemetery maintenance, equipment repair. Professional services is our legal, some accounting, auditing. Other services covers things like travel and conferences, which I've pretty much cut completely out of the budget. Cart transport, some postage, any kind of items that we have to, any kind of items that we have to post in the newspaper, which are quite costly. And it's quite unfortunate because nobody really reads the newspaper anymore. Education. So, a 4.14% increase might sound like a lot, but really it's not that much that's actually going towards education, aside from the salary increase and insurance increase, which accounts for 74% of the net increase of our education budget. So all of our teachers will have a raise in pay due to our contractual union increases. And then, of course, every contract for our teachers' pay is different based on step increases. We also have, again, inflation, which we're seeing as far as heating oil, and of course this affects transportation. So contractually, inflation is really the biggest driver here. We have some strategic investments, which are accounting for 14% of this budget. And then other state requirements and enrollment is 12% of the increase. I'm a firm believer in continuing to move our schools forward. I think this is a very reasonable budget, and quite frankly, I think down the road we're going to have to look at giving more to the schools. There's just this great deal of need. There's some maintenance, buildings and grounds things that need to be addressed, as well as some additional academic and mental health needs from the pandemic. And those include educational, social, and psychological items that would involve more social work, summer schools, and some interventionists. On to debt service. In 2022, we're starting to pay on our initial principal payments for the first half of the bonds for the new center, the new Candlewood Lake Elementary School. And in 2023, we're going to start paying on the initial principal on the second half of those bonds. In 2024, we're going to start paying on the principal for the first half of the bonds, and in 2025, we're going to start paying on the principal on the second half of those bonds. I have to keep reminding myself that a new school is not free. We have obligations here. The bond interest and the bond principal is paid out of the general fund. The $31,742 you see is for the lease on the townside copier machines only. This is under our short-term financing. And then the $12,000 you see for financing costs is other miscellaneous fees to pay for our bond attorney on our financing fees. I'm learning through this whole process that there are things that just can't be escaped when it comes to a budget, and debt is one of them. But fortunately, we have our Board of Finance and our controller who have all of this under control. And we have the glide path to paying down our debt. Referring to the debt bubble, I just want to point out that the high school debt for the old debt should be paid off by 2027. So we had a capital projects committee that was established by the previous administration in 2021. And this is a brief history of what we went through to get to our capital projects. The charge of the ad hoc committee was to review the capital submissions for 2022-23 prior to the budget year beginning, and it consisted of members of the Boards of Finance, Board of Ed, and Board of Selectmen. In December of last year, the Board of Selectmen included me as their new representative to the committee. We met in December and January, and we reviewed all the capital project requests, regardless of the funding sources, which were ARPA, bonding, and cash. We literally reviewed hundreds of pages of documentation, and we met together with each department that was proposing capital projects to gain a better understanding. And then discussions were held on the merits of each project. By February, I made the initial decisions on the capital budget, And in March, the Board of Selectmen reviewed and made some final changes. And by March 17th, the Board of Finance held additional meetings with the departments. They reviewed the budget and made final changes to the town's overall and long-term needs. And again, on March 29th, we presented the bonded capital, and we set the referendum date for the bonded capital for May 17th. These are the items that we plan to pay in cash for our capital. And the main takeaways of these numbers include the capital that's paid by taxes, so this is cash. And we're proud to say that for the first time, 100% of our paving will be paid in cash. It's $1.425 million, which accounts for 70% of the total cash spent on capital. It's also been really interesting and important to understand why putting money away into the reserves to have for future purchases is important, so we're not hit all at once. And then this is our capital paid with bonds, which we touched on the 29th of March at our meeting here. And I do really want to just touch on this big item at the top, which is our townwide communication system that we're proposing. It's going to be really important that this goes through on this referendum. Right now we're operating off of a very old system. It's an analog system from 1986. And the rest of our surrounding towns and most of the state of Connecticut has already converted to a digital system. Well, why is this important? In an emergency, in any crisis, right now we've got pockets across town that just don't have the coverage that we need. And in fact, there's been instances here in this school where radio frequencies haven't been able to be received. I think we had one upgrade on the 1986 system in 2008, which is already a long time ago. So we just have to get up to snuff with our technology and our telecommunications town-wide. We have to make sure our gaps across town are filled in order for our public works, our police, our 2 volunteer fire companies, and our EMS to work effectively and efficiently to provide the best public safety and health care that we can hope for. If anybody has any specific questions on this system, I'd really encourage you to reach out to our police chief, to our fire chief, to myself. We'd be happy to answer any questions. Another thing to keep in mind is that we have the largest lake in Connecticut on the one side of town, and on the other side of town we have another lake. Especially down in Lake Illinois area, there's some pockets down in that ravine where there's just no coverage, and in case of an emergency, it's vital that we're going to have that our emergency response has access to these places. So that was the one item that I wanted to highlight there, which you'll see on the budget at the referendum. A summary of our revenues. When I look at this slide, the one thing that jumps out at me is the percent increase for other revenues. We went from $3,000 in 2021 to 2022 to $250,000 for this budget. And what does this mean? Well, some of this, we're expecting reimbursements from the federal government for some of the big storms we've had here in town, which include Ida, Isaias, and then other relief programs to cover COVID and our vaccine clinics. So once we see that, hopefully we'll be able to bring that number down. We've had to use premium on bonds as one-time sources to cover our debt bubble. And we're going to have a debt service spike, like I mentioned earlier, over the next 3 to 4 years. The taxes, the licenses and permitting, and the charges for services are based on 5-year averages, but one thing that's important to keep in mind is that not everybody pays their taxes. So to the mill rate, which I think everybody's interested in. So I'd take your attention down to the bottom right-hand corner. For the first bullet, you'll see our mill rate increase, if you haven't already looked, is 3.15%. When I first started looking at the budget in January, this number came in at well over 5%, and I said that's completely unacceptable. I was really wanting to come in at under 3, but with the state of where we are in Brookfield, our town controller and I, we started calling them hardships. It included the pandemic, the debt bubble, which I've talked about, some of the price escalations because of inflation, and the re-eval. So I want to touch briefly on the re-eval. If you haven't already done your own calculation based off of the value of your house, I would encourage you to do that. We all know the reevaluation was done this year. It was kind of a perfect storm that I entered as far as a lot of things going on all at once. But the re-eval increased our tax base by over 20%, which means we can reduce our mill rate by a corresponding amount. But not all properties changed in the same way. The overall average increase in real estate values was 20%, but as I mentioned, not all properties were valued the same. So for example, those near the water, if you had water access or water views or water front, I guess, they averaged a 37% increase. So these homes will absorb most of the tax burden, and then others increased significantly less than that. And this year it happened to be the commercial properties. And on average, they only increased by 8%. So obviously they will absorb less of this tax burden. And then car values increased on average anywhere between 12 and 16%. And it's strange this year because car values usually go down, but because of the pandemic and then supply chain issues, and if anybody's tried to buy a car lately, we all know that prices are exorbitant if you can find a car at all. So what exactly does this mean? Last year, I believe home values, an average home in Brookfield was $350,000. So if your house increased this year, let's say your house is worth $400,000, and you do the math according to this mill rate at 3.15%, you can expect to pay about $7,200 in taxes. Is anybody happy about this? The answer is no, myself included. However, again, the Board of Selectmen, the Board of Finance, we did, I believe, the absolute very best we could, and we honestly think that this is a very reasonable budget. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to John, and when he's done, I'll just conclude. Thanks, John.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Tara. Briefly going to give my annual report, which is one of the things I absolutely look forward to. I promise I'm only going to say the word debt bubble once tonight. So I know we're hearing that a lot, but that's a key word to think about when you go home. In the early part of 2020 and into 2021, we saw interest rates decline significantly, affecting the amount of interest that the town earned on our investable balances. During that time, we saw a decrease of at least $350,000 in investment revenue from the previous fiscal year. But through the pandemic, we were able to work closely with our two banking institutions, so that's Union Savings Bank and Newtown Savings Bank, to ensure that we could pull in a market rate by altering our investment options from the traditional money market to a more sophisticated product, such as an insured cash sweep and something called a repo or repurchase agreement as an alternative. While these instruments were yielding close to zero, Dan, you know the market, for a fair amount of the year, We were absolutely earning more than what we would have been had we taken a more relaxed approach and stayed in that typical money market account setup. Looking forward into 2022, as interest rates are rising, we're working proactively with our bank reps to ensure that we can stay as conservative as a town as we're supposed to be, but remain aggressive in maximizing future interest income. Actively managing our money within the tight constraints of the rules for our municipality is very different than, say, the average resident's E-Trade account. We can't take 25 million of tax dollars and put it into Bitcoin, unfortunately, but we are keeping in close contact with the banks, I should say, to ensure that we don't miss an appropriate yield as that rate environment changes. I turned it off. My bad. There we go. Look at that. Beautiful. I spent some time on this slide, so I'm glad it came up. One item of interest in looking at the number of checks. So just so you guys know, once a week, I actually work with the finance team on the town side and on the school side to receive an email. And in that email is a PDF out of the accounting software that the town and the school use. And what it does is it lists all the checks that we pay out. And I kind of review them. I'm very familiar with all the vendors, just so I'm aware of where our money's going. So actually asked Kevin, who's over there, who's the deputy controller, I asked him to identify, tell me about an area that the town should know about, that's something that is improving or something that is on the up and up, because we do have a lot of, unfortunate news, with the economy and everything else that's been going on. So just briefly talk about this. One item of interest in looking at the number of checks that the town finance department processed in the last couple of fiscal years, one of the interesting things is that that number declines as time goes on. And I wanted to give a shout out, some recognition to someone named Lorraine. She's one of the employees in the finance team. She identified an area where she could add efficiency by working with all the departments to consolidate their billing for the larger scale vendors that we work with, namely Amazon and WB Mason. So as you can see with the paper shortage, we're going in the right direction with less checks, and I think Lorraine should be applauded for that efficiency. The town and the school finance departments both continue to navigate through these challenging times, whether it be through implementing proper controls and procedures where at one point in time there were absolutely none, because there was a time when there were none. Or finding efficiencies like Lorraine in the finance department. They're all doing a stellar job. The most important thing for the short term is that we actively manage our finances to address our town's future needs and ensure that we make it through that debt bubble. Thank you for your time.
To conclude by stressing again that I really do believe collectively the Board of Finance and the Board of Selectmen, together with our town controller and our deputy controller, we worked very hard at coming up with this, what we are calling a very responsible and reasonable budget. I did want to thank everybody for their hard work and the patience of me being new on this learning curve, especially the Board of Selectmen, the Board of Finance, the Finance Office, particularly Marcia and Kevin. Marcia is unavailable this evening. Our Board of Ed, thank you so much. Our Capital Committee, all of our departments, our public safety officials. It's been a learning process, and I really, again, do hope to see this thing be a first time go. So, have a good night, and Will, there you are.
Thank you, Terry and John. Okay, at this point, we would like to open it up for any questions or comments from the public. If you have any questions or comments you'd like to make, you can come up to the microphone and just announce your name and address.
Nobody's going to start, I will.
Go for it.
Be shy, folks.
You hear me okay? Good. George Walker, 24 Villanona Drive, here in Brookfield, and I'm one of those folks that lives on the other lake, on the other side of town, Villanona versus over at Candlewood. And I do have to commend everybody for all the hard work that's gone into this budget. Having been on Board of Finance previously, many years ago myself, and as a selectman, I've been through a number of these meetings. And it's very difficult to come in at the target of under 3%, which I think is something we've tried to achieve and tried to do over the years. This year happens to be slightly over the 3%, and I know that in the past that any time that we've been over 3%, when it goes to the voters, there's a lot of voters come out and vote against it, and sometimes the budget has difficulty getting passed. Now this particular year is really monumental because we had the reval. Been through a couple of those myself, and we've had to be very creative in past years when we had a reval because, let me tell you, when the tax bills hit the people who, they've had some substantial increases in the revaluation, they're going to be coming screaming to Town Hall, the Board of Finance, and of course, they will go and try to get their valuations reduced. I've seen it before, and I suspect it's going to happen in spades. I did a little bit of homework on this budget. It's hard to cut from it, but I said, okay, how is that going to affect me? Everybody in this room who lives in town has got to be saying, what's this new budget going to cost me, especially with the reval? Now, if you haven't done your homework on it, you should. I don't know whether this is being televised or not, but those people at home should do the math. And I think that Tara hit the target right on the nail on the head with 20% increase in your revaluation. You are going to have, you'll be right there at about that 3.1% increase in your taxes. If you have a valuation that's over 20%, your taxes are going to be significantly higher than what we are seeing up on the screen here. I happen to be one of those, by the way. My valuation went up 24%. I did my entire neighborhood, and we ranged from a little bit under 20% to some that were 30% increases. Now, what does that mean to me as I look at it? I did the math so that I personally am faced with a 6.5% increase in my taxes based upon this budget and the revaluation. That's real numbers. And if you haven't done the math, you should do it to understand what we're dealing with. My neighbors on the street where I'm at, we have some 16 homes in my neighborhood, and 60% of those homes all went substantially over 20%. So they're virtually going to be, most of them are going to be double the 3.1% increase in taxes. Like myself, 6.5%. So I don't want to throw a wet blanket on this, but I think if there's an opportunity for some more money someplace, or for us to take a look at it, I think we should do that. And the area that has always been a hot button that we would reach out and we would try to work with over the years, I would like to hear from anybody from the Board of Finance or Tara or anybody else here tonight, this fund balance. Where are we with the fund balance? Unless I missed it in the presentation, I didn't see how much money went into the fund balance, how much is there. I know there's targets to try to get up to. I'm hearing numbers that are somewhere in the 12 to 15% fund balance. Those are big numbers, and that's taxpayers' money that's sitting in a big pot. That's the rainy day fund, okay? Now, what we would do in the past, in a year like this, we would reach into that fund balance and not contribute as much to it in a particular year and help the taxpayers reduce the tax burden. And I'm suggesting we take a look at that. But I would like to hear about the fund balance, that sort of thing. Sorry to bore you with some of these details, but I'm dealing with real numbers. I've done the homework on it, and I'm not going to get into tearing the budget apart or anything like that, because I think that the Board of Finance and the Selectmen and everybody involved really did a wonderful job of cutting that down. Now, one area that I think we should be looking at is how much do we have in the fund balance? How much do we really need in that? Because when I was a selectman and on the Board of Finance, we were in the 7-8%. And now I understand it's 12, trying to push up to 15%. And I keep hearing we're going to get lower interest rates. How much lower can the interest rates get? How much money are we really going to be saving by boosting up and putting that money in that rainy day fund that belongs to every single taxpayer in this town? Thank you.
Thank you, George. Anyone
So
else?
I'll start, and then I've asked Steve to chime in, and Kevin, please feel free if you can, but I appreciate those. Yeah. I appreciate those comments, Mr. Walker, and thank you for recognizing that it is a reasonable budget overall. I think it's a pretty valid question about the fund balance. From my understanding, we have to be very cautious with what we're doing there. And as you know from your years of service, it is important to maintain that money in case we need it for something that's unforeseen. We went back and forth quite extensively over how much we were going to allocate, how much we were going to take out. So there's been a lot of conversations on that regard. I'll turn it over to Steve.
Yeah, 7 years ago, our fund balance was at 5%. The town discovered that we had lost $3.3 million of $5 million in that fund. We immediately began to build it back up because we knew that we had to, or our bond ratings would go down. In fact, Moody's did downgrade us with a negative outlook. They've since taken that away. At that point in time, George, you're absolutely right. The target fund for fund balance back then was between 8 and 10%. That's what the bond agencies wanted to see to get a AAA rating. Now, we moved our fund balance up. It's north of, I believe, 13% now. Is that correct? 15.5. Oh, so it's up to 16.5. Bond ratings agencies right now, 15.5, I'm sorry. Bond rating agencies are now looking for somewhere between 18 and 20%. Of the 30 AAA towns in Connecticut that have the AAA rating, all of them are between 18 and one of them is at 30%. That's kind of an outlier. But in talking to the bond counsel and our financial advisor, for example, we borrowed $63 million for a new school. If we did not have a AAA rating and went down to a AA rating, you would pay somewhere between 40 and 75 basis points more in interest. That is about, on $63 million, between $350,000 and $420,000 a year that you would pay in addition over a 20-year life. That would be $8 million the town would pay. So having a strong fund balance is very, very important, especially when you're borrowing like Brookfield has for a big school. In the borrowings, we did 2 borrowings for the school. The average rate we got on those was about 1.65%. Our initial analysis when we got the bonds approved by the whole town, approved building the school, the 10-year plan called for repaying between 4 and 6%. That savings alone is over $38 million over the original estimate. So yes, you do want to be very, very careful in managing your fund balance, but you need to keep it to a level so that when you do need to borrow, you can save millions of dollars in that when you do borrow. Does that answer your question, George?
What's the, at the 15 point whatever percent?
Yeah.
How much does that represent in the fund balance today?
11.1 million.
Well, our budget is $78 million, so that would be about $11 million.
Okay, $11 million.
Right, $11 million we have in the
Sitting in
bank.
that pot, okay.
Sitting in that pot. You also have to realize 7 years ago, we had to borrow money every single year to pay for capital projects. And we would use what is called BANs, bond anticipation notes, which means you were paying a much higher rate to borrow money for 2 or 3 years till you build up a big enough balance in borrowing to go out long term. We no longer have to borrow every year. We're not paying 4, 5, and 6% on $2, $3, $4 million for 3 or 4 years until we have enough of a package, 15 to 20 million, to make it worthwhile to go out for bonding. On that alone, we're probably saving a few $100,000 over those 3 or 4 years. And that's because we have enough money in the bank. We can fund our projects internally. So long term, over the next 5 to 10 years, the townspeople are saving a lot of money. And I understand people say, why do you have all this money in the bank? This is why. Because it saves you money in the long term.
Thank you, Steve and Tara. Anyone else? No? Okay.
Well, yeah, I would like to say something. Harry Shearer, I'm speaking as a selectman, but anyone in here who knows me knows that I'm a very conservative person. We have a very conservative family. I'm proud of that, but I can tell you that many people think that the best budget is the lowest budget. I've been a private business owner for 41 years. I've been 14 years on the Board of Education, and I'm now in my 5th year as selectman. And at one point in my life, I did think that. But the best budget is not the lowest budget if it jeopardizes your future. And what I've found is that these meetings, I've been involved in a lot of these meetings, mostly with the Board of Education and the Board of Finance. These aren't meetings where everyone sits around and says, well, let's add here, and everybody says yes. Well, let's take away here. These meetings have, if you want an enlightening moment, go to one of these meetings. There are people who end up in opposite corners. There is confrontation, but the bottom line is we're all heading in the same direction. I was so happy to be part of this program because of the hard work and the respect that both boards and all boards had. In the long run, this was not an easy task, but I can tell you that the reason why we came up with this, and the reason why, as a very conservative person, I think that 3.15 is a very respectable and honest budget, is because we are not jeopardizing your future. Could we have come in at 2% or 2.5%? We could have come in with anything. But heaven help us 3 and 4 and 5 years down the road. So I just wanted to make this statement. So listen, I'm at the age now where I'm approaching retirement, which I probably will never be able to do. I am very aware of taxes. And I want to pay as little tax as I have to. But I don't want it to jeopardize my future. And I am very confident that this budget is going to pass as long as people understand that this is your best interest in mind, not only for today, but for the next year and the year after and for the next 10 years. And I'm very proud to be part of this budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. Anyone else have a public comment or question? Besides the guy in the hall? No? Okay, then I will close this portion of our meeting. As you know, we're not voting on this budget this evening. That will go to referendum, but we do need to set the referendum date, and that is our next order of business. So I'll ask for a motion from the floor to set Tuesday, May 17th, from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. as the date and time for the annual budget referendum. That's what I said, isn't it? 5 times in a row, I screwed that. Thank you. I'll restate it. I'd like a motion from the floor to set Tuesday, May 17th from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. Thank you. As the date and time for the annual budget referendum. Bob, thank you. Fred? Fred. Any discussion? No? Okay. Could I have all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Motion passes. I would like to call for adjournment. Motion for adjournment? Thank you, Bob. Busy man over there today. Any second? Second, okay, thank you. And all those in favor?
Aye.
Very good, thank you very much, have a good evening.